I had this memory of getting a cheap disc copy, remember when physical media was still a thing? Of Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, and eagerly firing it up on my old and crappy PC. Although I started out around the PS2 and obviously would later go back and play classics like Fallout and the Infinity Engine, a lot of my formative gaming experiences was in this mid-2000s sweet spot, a time where games were still trying to be interesting and creative as a greater push into the console market led to higher production values from the likes of BioWare. Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning came out at the tail end of this, a game that was too ambitious for its own good, even if it hadn't released in the wake of Skyrim only a few months before. It's difficult to describe why I have a fondness for games like these, but it takes me back to a time where I didn't have much money. I was sinking hundreds and hundreds of hours into games like Oblivion and Dragon Age Origins, and the potential of gaming seemed limitless. There was a wonder to it, these beautiful open-world RPGs and epic fantasy, a beauty that is impossible to capture now, even with the biggest game worlds possible or mechanical bloat to pad out the runtime. This is, hopefully, the first of a planned series where I'll be revisiting some of the older, forgotten RPGs and see whether it's just nostalgia, or much like the greats of Fallout, Baldur's Gate, or Morrowind, they really do stand the test of time. Obviously, my original disc copy is long gone by now. Either it's at the bottom of a lake somewhere or kicking around a box at my parents' place. So I'm playing the Re-Reckoning port here, which was little more than high resolution and some fixes thrown in for good measure. Amalur is an experimental game that certainly flew too close to the sun, but I'll be damned if it doesn't have soul. If you didn't already know, Kingdoms of Amalur started out as an MMO, and you can definitely feel that in how it plays. Usually this would be a major red flag because I detest all forms of MMO design infesting single-player games. Just look at how bloated Dragon Age Inquisition was. But the animation work does a lot of the heavy lifting here. The term MMO is something we're going to be coming back to a lot in this video, but it's in the gameplay department where Kingdoms of Amalur arguably succeeds the most. With the gigantic budgets of today and how diluted the term RPG has become to the point of being meaningless, it's difficult to convey how bad so-called action combat had been up until this point. For the record, I don't mind it. If you're into RPGs, you kinda just have to accept that most games didn't have a very high bar when it comes to the feel and mechanical depth of combat. Oblivion was hilariously spongy. The Witcher had this weird rhythm game more than anything else, but while it certainly caters to the casual action crowd, Kingdoms of Amalur makes combat feel pretty good actually. Granted, this comes with a few drawbacks. First of all, the world progression and enemies are all level scaled, at least within the banding of each region. This naturally means you're going to be thrown a million coloured tier loot items that feels more at home in a Diablo-style ARPG than anything else, but for what the game set out to do, combat is pretty solid. It took a while to get used to the combat at first. Maybe I'm alone in this, but the keyboard controls felt odd, so you might have to mess around with rebinding some to make it feel better. Still, as long as you're keeping up with a new weapon every few levels to not be outscaled in damage, Amalur has a pretty good balance between action and stat bloat. You'll already have noticed the camera, which, despite having a key to toggle to over the shoulder, this doesn't actually do anything, so the game is essentially this pulled back dynamic camera view the whole time. Naturally, that means your view will be blocked at times by walls and other collision, or mobs of enemies where it might be difficult to track, but you'll get used to it. You can customize the camera under settings, but I imagine a lot of people will be missing a proper lock-on system to compensate for it. Amalur has an open class system centered around its three core stats: might, finesse, and sorcery. No prizes for guessing which archetypes those apply to, but for this playthrough I went with a purely strength-focused warrior. To the game's credit, the weapon variety here is just as diverse as the enemies you'll be encountering. You have swords, hammers, staves, and bows, to more experimental stuff like chakrams and these fey blades for more of a rogue mage hybrid playstyle. I particularly enjoyed juggling enemies mid-air, something I want more RPGs to take lessons from character action games like DMC because it feels awesome. Now, usually I'm not a fan of giving players the option to respec because it defeats the purpose of having a build in the first place, but given the sheer range of weapons and the devs going out of their way to encourage experimentation, it's good to have the option for players who might want to change things up. This might sound like a nitpick, but shields are essentially useless. First of all, you don't even have them visually equipped, because the developers wanted every class to be able to use them, so blocking is instead bound to a separate key. Thing is, with how easy it is to be carving through most enemies or wailing on the larger bosses, there are very few times where you'll need to block. Amalur is an action game through and through, and there's little incentive to ever use shields, save for perhaps the equipment buffs. Finally, my biggest criticism, particularly for melee characters, is that it's way too easy to be interrupted during attacks. This is at its worst in fights with a pack of the giant-like creatures called Enin, or getting ganked by a bunch of mages, because you'll barely get a hit in. For an action game, it's a weird choice there isn't some kind of hyper armor, or whatever it was called from the Soul series, or at least being able to cancel out of attacks. So just keep that in mind if you're going to go melee like me. And yes, I know there's an ability to compensate for it, but firstly, why should that be relegated to an ability in the first place, especially for people not spec'd into might, when the attack-dodge combo is something most players will be using far more than shields? Because raw damage is the only thing that really matters, combat can descend into button mashing at times, but the range of abilities per archetype are decent enough to make your playstyle feel distinct. Outside of core combat, the rest of Amalur's gameplay is fairly unremarkable. You have a bunch of skills that are mostly arbitrary, which of course crafting has to be there, but given that quests are little more than an excuse to go from one dungeon or combat encounter to the next, the fight, reward, explore loop is nothing out of the ordinary for its time. Really, the biggest problem with the skill system is that because you can do everything, it essentially means nothing. Sure, you can craft equipment or slot in gem upgrades, but why would you when you're practically falling over loot everywhere you look? Sure, you can invest in alchemy or lockpicking or traps or detecting hidden chests, but why bother with any of these when you can easily pay for it instead? Why invest in repairing gear when you can do it for a pittance or just use a repair kit? The economy is so broken you can pay for everything. Don't even bother trying to loot the hidden chests or craft things because it's all crap. The only arguably necessary skill is persuasion, and it works the same way as other games. It doesn't lead to some big branching dialogue choices, it's just there for a little more gold or information. None of this is essential to progress. Ultimately, it's whatever. I'll give the game some credit in that I never felt like I was grinding, which is something I fucking hate in single player games, and if anything, a testament to bad design, because exploration in Amalur and the decent array of quests was satisfying enough to keep me going through the world. Speaking of which, it's about time we see what this setting has to offer. This is the part where I should probably revoke my gamer card and hang my head in shame because I have never played World of Warcraft. I bring that up because this is another aspect where the MMO influence is apparent in how the world is separated into distinct zones. Before we get to that though, we should talk about the visuals and overall art style of the game. With the exception of Oblivion, bright, whimsical fantasy with popping colours is something I began to associate with MMOs and any game that, for some reason, has every character looking like a supermodel. It's a different story today, but there was a time where it seemed like every other week there was a WoW killer or the next big MMO being released, and it was the visuals in particular that started to blend together. Guild Wars, Black Desert Online, Final Fantasy XIV, Lord of the Rings Online, Neverwinter, and, of course, the Old Republic. It's clear that Kingdoms of Amalur took heavy inspiration from WoW in this department as well, but it actually kind of works. Maybe that's just the nostalgia talking again, but the chunky character models, the overuse of bloom and shafts of light in woodland areas to glowing mushrooms and cobwebs dotting cave walls, it feels like a product of better times. It's also a testament to the power of good art direction over pure fidelity. My favourite area was probably the Teeth of Naros, which was a post-launch story DLC, with its floating city of Greek-inspired architecture and the Colossae people made of stone. Given how oversaturated the RPG market was at the time, Amalur doesn't make the best first impression by starting in a generic woodland forest area for the first 10 or so hours, because there are windswept canyons, craggy mountains, rolling hills dotted with farms, and much more than just the same biome you've seen a million times before. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to make the game out as some groundbreaking masterpiece, or even that it was particularly creative for its time. You have elves doing elf things, various flavors of fantasy races that are little more than their classic archetype, but it's cohesive at the very least. The faces do suffer the most, character creation is pretty basic even for its time, so get ready to see the same handful over and over again. One of the major characters, Agarth, who was voiced by the same guy who did Canderous from KOTOR, funnily enough, looked like my guy's brother, but it's whatever. One area that will quickly stand out is, unfortunately, the dungeons. Get ready to see this one kit over and over again, at least in the starting region, because if you've seen one mine or cave or dungeon, you've pretty much seen them all. Remember, if anything, this was a big step up at the time, considering how awful and repetitive dungeons had been in most games up until that point. Just look at the caves in Oblivion or Morrowind, for example. Still, while there is some life to it, you're going to end up feeling like you're running through the same place over and over again. At least it's not literally like Dragon Age 2, I guess. Really, the biggest downside to the world design is the lack of a jump button. When we pair this with the fact there's collision everywhere, console-based RPGs practically had invisible walls as a requirement. It's odd that something so key to traversal is missing. It's obvious this game was made first for consoles. Mini-maps are another thing I'm glad we left well in the past. But you're telling me that no one could fit something as essential as a jump button on a controller. Instead, you get these specific drop-down points out in the world. It's strange that no one thought it was worth investing in allowing players to scale fences or drop down like a 2cm decline. You already have the option to swim, but no, you have to walk around exactly as the layout says. The Re-Reckoning port from THQ Nordic that was released in 2020 was heavily criticized at the time for shoddy performance, but I didn't run into any technical hiccups. Other than some strange key binding choices, as I mentioned earlier, this ran pretty much flawless throughout, which is nice, but it has been 5 or so years now. Draw distance leaves something to be desired. It's a shame the remaster didn't at least try and address enemies often popping out of thin air only a short distance in front of you, but it's not a deal breaker. This is still just a port, and working with the tech of its time. Beyond that, there's not much else to say in the visual department. I have a fondness for Amalur. Maybe that's less to the game's credit, and more a reminder of different times. A colourful world and strange proportions is often more fable than wow. But while the soundtrack isn't anything special, and the dialogue interface is pretty much a one-to-one copy of Dragon Age 2's dialogue wheel, Kingdoms of Amalur has an impressive range of biomes, and most importantly, character to its world. It's big enough to explore without feeling like you're just going through the motions or wasting time running across empty space. Load times are quick, and fast travel means you can quickly move from one area to the next and hand in quests without breaking the flow. If you know anything about Kingdoms of Amalur, it would be the big names the developers managed to get on the box. Ken Ralston, one of the lead designers on Oblivion, R.A. Salvatore, the acclaimed writer of the Drizzt book series, and Todd McFarlane, the creator of Spawn, means this should be a match made in heaven, right? I'm skeptical anytime there's big names brought into production. Just look at John Carpenter with Dead Space, who took a paycheck for doing literally nothing, for the same reasons I've talked about with voice actors and influences before. Kingdoms of Amalur clearly wanted to be the next big thing, but let's be real. The world building and story is completely unremarkable. It's not bad by any means, more that it's just safe. There's very little here that you haven't seen in a million fantasy games before it. Elves lording over everyone in a legally distinct version of Mirkwood, kind-hearted lumberjacks who work hard and then retire to the cozy tavern each night, gnome inventors dabbling with ingenious devices, fae with soft Irish accents. This is classic archetypal fantasy. Whether that's a good or bad thing for you will depend on how tired you might be of it all, but coming back to the nostalgia mentioned earlier, while I don't think it's particularly unique, it's hard to deny that Amalur feels cozy. The story is the same thing you played a million times before. You're essentially the chosen one, reborn outside of fate, which ties into the super move system and class or archetype cards for each playstyle I mentioned earlier, and you're going up against the big bad elf in a war that's been raging for years. This will probably end up as the shortest of all the dedicated videos I've done so far, because there aren't any companions, and there isn't a single memorable character worth talking about either. You have the reluctant mentor figure who likes to drink, the smoky femme fatale elf with dubious allegiances, fantastical beings that speak in riddles, and, again, it's nothing you haven't seen before. The voice acting in general is solid. You'll recognise a lot of them, like the guy who voiced the default male Nord voice type in Skyrim, Robin Atkin-Downes, Jim Cummings, Liam O'Brien, Simon Templeman, Steve Blum, Greg Ellis, Courtney Taylor, Kari Walgren. Clearly the cast is talented. It's more the material they were working with. Again, they're not bad, it's just safe. We come back to the MMO influence again, because a lot of this is just flavour to string you from one combat or biome to the next. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Many RPGs haven't had particularly great main stories or world building either, but just to make it clear, you're going to be disappointed if you're coming in expecting the next big thing in character-focused RPGs like classic BioWare or The Witcher. Reckoning is classic high fantasy to a T. Unlike Divinity, for example, which is so light-hearted and incapable of taking itself seriously, the game is at least committed to the bit. In terms of tone, it leans more towards the whimsy of Fable than the gritty edgelord phase of The Witcher or other AA titles of the 2000s. It has the epic fantasy moments like the Battle of Melsenshire. It's a bit awkward when the pre-rendered cutscenes are completely silent. You even fight a God of War style boss creatively named Baelor and the Witch King, but unlike Oblivion, at least the engine can handle having more than a handful of NPCs on screen for the big story moments. Dialogue at least doesn't overstay its welcome, and although you can definitely see the MMO-style hub areas in a lot of these environments, it's still neat adventuring through the world in single player. Because there are no companions and the story isn't much to speak of, there isn't much else to say. There are factions, which is nice. I went with the Warsworn for obvious reasons, and didn't pay any attention to what was happening the whole time, but the final reward was a bit of coin. Now that is pathetic. The really good gear comes from the unique sets and sometimes a lucky roll on a good weapon you'll generally find out in the wild, but the factions make the world feel more fleshed out at least. Overall, the world building plays it safe, perhaps too much, but Kingdoms of Amalur is fine for what it does. Quests don't always need to be the most in-depth thing in the world, and I had a fun time just exploring and handing in quests. Just take my advice, stay away from the contract board. There's already enough padding as it is. Given how critical I've been, you might find it surprising that I still recommend Kingdoms of Amalur. I can see why some people think it's mediocre at best and a half-hearted shrug of a game, but while nostalgia undeniably plays a part, I have fond memories of playing games like these. It's been nice to return to a different time in the industry and game design practices. There is an irony in the fact this game was, in many ways, a pioneer, or at least a product of the streamlined mechanics and safe homogenized design that has led to what little passes for RPG today. But overall, revisiting this strange little gem has been a pleasant surprise. Kingdoms of Amalur is not a 10 out of 10 masterpiece of a game, but to be fair, I don't think it was ever trying to be. I would have been legitimately interested in a sequel for the series, but perhaps it's for the best that it ended with the developers, ideally with without bankrupting an entire US state. Who knows what THQ Nordic is up to these days, but after picking it up on GAG during a sale for like $15, I've had a great time with Amalur. Sure, it's not the kind of game that will last the ages, but it's comfy and a reminder of a good, solid RPG that's fun to sink some time into. Am I being too charitable? Maybe, but if you're looking for a fun RPG to suit any level of experience, you can do a whole lot worse, and Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning.